Decoding Future Leadership is an audiovisual podcast breaking open the capabilities, technologies, growth strategies, and mental fitness required to lead our future working world. A collaboration between PeopleStrong, the customer's choice for HR tech across Asia Pacific, and Future Leadership, each episode addresses the challenges of a hybrid workforce with a blend of human capability and HR technology solutions. Let's get into this week's episode.
Hi there, I'm Dr. Marcele De Sanctis and I'm the Managing Partner of Cognitive Solutions and CLA brands within the Future Leadership organisation. It is my pleasure to welcome today's guest to the Decoding Future Leadership podcast, Professor Bob Wood. Welcome, Bob. Bob is a Distinguished Professor at the University of Technology in Sydney, Honorary Professor at the Florey Institute and Founder and Director of Research at the Centre for Ethical Leadership in Ormond College, University of Melbourne. His research into bias, adaptivity and the implications of technology when it comes to talent acquisition and capability development have been seminal and have really led the way in a lot of our thinking around these critical future of work and leadership topics. So it's my pleasure to have you on the show today. Welcome, Bob. How are you?
Thanks, Marcel. I'm very well. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, good. I think it certainly goes without saying that technology may well be one of the most powerful business tools that we have, and in particular as people functions and HR functions that we have in creating diverse, equitable and inclusive organisations. If we think about the role of technology in really enabling diversity, it's certainly a top business priority today. I was really keen to explore some of these themes in our discussion. And I wanted to just start with this idea that really, a lack of inclusion has quite serious implications for improving and maintaining equality among all citizens. But the issue is not just important for employees. Underemployment of minority applicants can hurt organisations and actually limit their ability to gain, full competitive advantage. What has your work revealed when it comes to human bias holding us back when it comes to making key talent decisions and thinking about company performance?
Well, Marcel, just to comment on the technology, I think the new business models that have been enabled by technology have been quite interesting. One is they've cut out a lot of intermediaries, so that removes sort of noise in the system. In many decision-making processes, we can deal directly with a supplier or a ticket provider or whatever. We don't have to go through intermediaries. I think the other thing is the benefit of that, it provides access to everybody, or much broader access to a lot of services and opportunities. For example, among millennials and others, people are not using credit cards now. They're going away from that intermediary and using more direct forms of payment and the like. They're exchanging directly, peer-to-peer and the like. So a lot of good has come out of technology. In the employment, so while the business models are somewhat clearer and, how do you make money out of these things? And as always, it's some successes and some failures. But what is not fully walked through is the implications for work. There's been quite a bit of evidence has come out that algorithms are being increasingly used in selection, and they're prone to bias, just like humans are. And that's a problem of if you develop an algorithm through machine learning on historical data, and that historical data is biased, then the preferred prototypes are going to be biased in the way, and so that can be quite subtle, and and it's a bit like human bias. You really can't observe human bias directly. Sometimes when you're in a meeting and somebody says something, you can infer it from behaviour. But we have to observe it from the outcomes. And, of course, it's very difficult to infer it from a single outcome. We tend to need an accumulative impact. So I've recently been dealing with a legal case where a young mother was, I feel, discriminated against, but it's very hard to prove because people say, no, there's facts in the situation, so it's very difficult to establish. Whereas if you look over time and single mothers in this organisation are not being hired or they're not being given preferential treatment or whatever, that's the only way you can establish. So it's interesting. We have the same problems with algorithms and technology in terms of bias. Now, in terms of access, I think there's, in the use of technology and inclusion, interestingly, I feel, and this is just a personal experience, I don't have any research, I feel that working with my team over the last 2 years, using different teleconferencing technologies like this one, has increased inclusion. We've become much more aware of one another. We had a formal process where we talked for a while about what movies have you seen, what books are you reading. So it was a much more inclusive process than others. So, but as I said, I think we're still working it through. I don't think we know all the answers about inclusion. The selection thing is very important. I think with a lot of decisions, like promotion decisions, any transition decision, I think that rather than just rely exclusively on technology, we should see it as an augmenting device, a screening device and whatever. And look, the best solution to bias is to be aware of it, accept it, and talk about it, and ask the question. Because bias is an unconscious process in most cases, and so if you raise it to consciousness and you approach it with a constructive, open mind, you'll know whether you're being biased or not.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We talk a lot about, particularly in selection and recruitment processes, every piece of information that is gathered throughout that process really is a data point. And ultimately, we are wanting to build confidence in the decisions that we're making by reducing error, by de-risking the decisions, by having more information at hand, and recognising where bias comes in at each of those stages, and for each of those data points, what is the inherent bias with a psychometric assessment? What is the inherent bias with an interview data point? What is the inherent bias with, other forms of information that you're collecting? I think is really important to recognise. And as you said, exactly, acknowledge them, understand what sort of prompts them, I guess, or perhaps has them come out, and recognise through that awareness when we can isolate how it might be influencing decision making.
Yeah, I think there's several really good points in your comment about the approach. First of all, the idea that any measure is just a data point; it's not a fact, right?
Yes.
And clearly, we have to use them to discriminate. That's their function, and so it's always a very important question to ask. Have they been validated for that function? The problem is many technologies have not been validated. As director of the Futures Academy, I've been approached by a lot of people who have video technologies for analysing voice and all that, and that's fine. They're useful as descriptors. But the moment you start saying, you Marcel score makes you a better fit for a job than mine, there's a whole validation process that needs to lie behind that. The fact that people can argue it doesn't actually prove it. So that's the first point I make. So I think that's really good that you do just treat these as data points and allow for the fact that, okay, well, it's not absolute. I mean, typically when they're extremes, then they're more informative than when they're just, like the difference between a 7.5 and an 8.2 may mean nothing. But if a person's got a 10 and a person's got a 1, that's probably telling you, something about the differences between them. So, I mean,
yes.
I think one of the problems people often use when they use when they use data like that is they don't appreciate that any difference can be just error, and so you have to rely on so small differences can be overinterpreted, and I think that's a very consideration. So that's one point. I think another point, of course, is in all bias, all of us over time build up an implicit model. When you work in an area, bias and expertise are just knowledge stored in long-term memory, right? And they can be very similar. Expertise is knowledge that works. Bias is knowledge that doesn't work some of the time or doesn't use all the data. But they operate in similar processes. And so the models you build up may be a very useful form of expertise, be it a model of the ideal candidate or whatever it is, a good worker. But they may be inappropriate for certain types of people, and they may be inappropriate for under certain work conditions. So a lot of change is going on right now, and so a lot of in work, and so a lot of the traditional models, the products we had, the services that we designed were designed for baby boomers like myself. And then my children, who are millennials, have quite a different view of the world. So, and of course, our biggest bias is confirmatory bias.
Yes.
The search for certainty can override the search for accuracy, particularly when there's complexity in the data. So once again, it's always just having the conversation, as you said, being alert to it, being alert to the possibility, and not getting defensive when it's raised. I think that's and it's also got a lot to do with how the decision process is run. I think if it's open and it's full of good constructive challenge, then you're doing all you can to minimise bias. But if it's very confirmatory and closed, it's not. Oh, I'll just before we pass off this topic, I just want to give you an example of how bias can become institutionalized. And so this is one of a global accounting firm. It's a very big firm, lots of employees. And I was called by one of their senior partners in Japan saying, look, he's got this young man who's an associate. He's trying to get him on the talent program. He is fantastic. He said he's great Japanese and all that. And he said he keeps getting knocked back. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Why? He said, well, when they do an assessment of him, he doesn't fit the profile. Now, anyway, to cut a long story short, we went through and searched this through and ended up speaking to the global director of HR. But basically what it turned out was, the ideal person for the talent team was your typical American, Anglo-Australian, maybe English, and he simply didn't fit that. He was Japanese, and so he came up quite different on independence scores and assertiveness scores, but he was the perfect fit for Japan. But so this, I think eventually, I don't know the sequel to the story, whether he got on the talent program, but certainly the HR people were very attuned to the conversation. But it made me think, this is a company that's, I don't know, probably in practically every country in the world, I don't know, but certainly a lot. And I'm just wondering how many people over the years have been discriminated against. And it's sort of one of the points I made to the HR director is, maybe this is one of the explanation why in Australia, every senior person in your your partnership until recent years has been white male and other parts of the world. So it's interesting. So when they're saying, and what the argument they were using is, well, we want them, but we just can't get the talented people. And the question wasn't, are the people talented? The question was your definition of talent.
This podcast is created by Fisher Leadership and proudly sponsored by PeopleStrong. Here's a message from PeopleStrong CEO Sandeep Chowdhury.
We indeed are living in the era of talent economy. The talent economy fundamentally for us means looking at the world of work, workplace, and workforce very differently than what we've essentially experienced and known in the pre-pandemic world. We fundamentally believe that experience, collaboration, and data will actually differentiate the best from the rest. With that ambition, PeopleStrong has brought the first talent operating system to enterprises to essentially be able to personalize the employee journey right from the hiring into the learning, performance, and the career management stage of every employee. We've done that with massive amount of AI and ML that will bring in the right decisions for an employee and for the enterprises to essentially take the biggest advantage of the crisis that we're just coming out of.
And it's really challenging in global multinational organizations which have a group people and culture function whose role it is with, the broader leadership group to define what high potential looks like and to cascade that definition that is all encompassing across the whole organization to say, this is our model of potential, this is what high potential talent looks like, this is our consistent global approach to talent management. How do you do that in a way that recognises those geographical location differences and cultural differences, striking that balance between a common language around leadership that organisations are constantly striving for, and a common definition around what high potential talent looks like to then create programs and experiences to support people's development. But recognising cultural nuances is, I think, a balance that is almost impossible to strike. And I think organisations grapple with it every day. It's really difficult.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think like many of these things, it's a dynamic process. It's not a fixed process. You don't have when you develop your global competency framework and you've got the solution, rather than it's got to be a dynamic process. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it is a set of tensions. You need some degree of standardization. The language, language carries culture. So standardizing language is a very important part of it. But language also can communicate a lot of bias. The words we use determine whether we're thinking from or illustrate, not determine, but illustrate whether we're using a growth or a fixed mindset. They illustrate whether we're in confirmatory bias. So language is very, very important. Yeah, it's a non-trivial challenge. I think, totally diverse, decentralized model of the world that says, okay, well, with individual differences. Now, keep in mind also, the point I want to make, Marcel, is these competency frameworks, our beliefs and desires, they are not validated predictors of performance, right? And now, if they're really bad, if they're just so at odds with what is the good employee, they would clearly get dismissed. But there's an element of preference in them. There's an element of bias in that sense. And so, yeah, it's a question I have to take on notice, but it's worth thinking about. How do you do this? Do you abandon global systems and processes and go local? And you could do that with a set of guidelines about what is an appropriate system and process, and maybe have some core components, but then allow for a lot of local flexibility.
It's an interesting one. I couldn't agree more. And I think you're right. Thinking about capability and those definitions of capability, there's that element of they need to be aspirational but equally achievable. And really it's that common language that harnesses that workforce. So, but for it to be effective, everyone needs to understand it and feel intrinsically motivated and connected to that language in some way. I want to explore a little bit around what's become the new norm, constant connectivity, remote working, obviously the enormous shift towards virtual working and collaboration as really the new norm, and how you see technology platforms creating collaborative spaces for people to connect and adapt to change as a cohesive team. What are your reflections with this shift that you've observed, and in particular implications for team performance, team functioning, team chemistry and leadership?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I have to say my thinking on this is still developing. Let me first of all reflect on my personal experiences, and then I can reflect. I have a daughter who's entered the workforce a year or so ago, and she sort of and my sons provide a marked contrast in that. So my personal experience with Zoom was, as I said earlier, I have a team of about 11 people. And so, and I see them regularly when we're working face to face and talk to them. But I've never quite known so much about them as I know now as a product of this meeting on Zoom, regularly, which is quite interesting. So a lot of the social curiosity, which I think is, my own research is, social curiosity is very important to empathy, and empathy is very important to interpersonal relations and leadership and the like. So the social curiosity is much more proactive than it was. I've always had staff who, I discussed books with, or I had a staff member whose whole family used to dress up like Star Wars characters and go out to see movies. And, and I used to talk to him about that. But there's a lot of depth, I just know more about people. And I'm the oldest person in our team, and the youngest person's probably about 25, right? So it's big. Oh, no, actually younger. Yeah, so it's a big range. And so it's been quite an interesting, we recommend books and stuff. So in that sense, the social cohesion has really grown. And But it's not just because of the technology. It's because of the way, and I cannot take credit. One of my staff has been very proactive on the mental health issue, and so it blossomed. And so what I've learned is whenever I work in a team now, I'm going to do that much more regularly. Like we do it fortnightly, and people really look for it. Everybody turns up, and it's so that's one thing. That's been really good, and so I refer to it as a sort of organised curiosity, which doesn't. Then we come back to the interactions on Zoom are very sequential, and when you've got 11 people, it's you queue. One person talks, and others can make comments, and so it's very much a form of sequential dependence. It makes it too easy for people to withdraw, whereas, you can manage any of these things, but like if we're sitting in a room saying, we might say, what do you think? Somebody's sitting there not talking, what do you think? So because I believe in inclusion and participation, I always use what I call round robin. Or turn. So every topic, beginning and end, I'll go around and say to each person, what do you think? Okay, and then build on that point. So that I would encourage people to do that sort of thing, because it's very easy for people to withdraw. They have something to say, but the opportunity doesn't seem right to them. So there's the two parts. I think the social curiosity and opportunity, I think it's got this limitation about the sequential nature of it. But I must say, all this technology around task management, which is sort of independent of the code thing, but these agile methods where we run task boards and all that has been fantastic for organising work and keeping us going. So that's been excellent. So I think we're still learning. Now, when I go to my daughter is quite comfortable working at home on her computer. She's a data analyst now, formerly a statistician, and works for a consulting firm that does lots of big projects and the like. And they have regular get-togethers. But she did say, and that company is quite interesting, they have an event, a social event where everybody gets together and they'll do something like bake a cake, or they'll send the ingredients around, they'll bake a cake. So she loves that. She's been absorbed into that. But for all that, she said there was nothing quite like getting together with them socially and meeting them. She worked for the company for 6 months before she met him face to face. And when she met them face to face, they went on a training program in Newcastle. She said it was just such a different experience. We sat around talking, in the evenings and discovered things about ourselves and all that sort of stuff. So it was quite a different experience. And I think that's the sort of depth of human contact that is very important. I think a lot of people have missed. And technology it does in a one-on-one, but it doesn't in a group setting.
I agree. And what you've been discussing has made me think of a couple of things. Number one, almost the requirement for leaders to develop the skill of facilitation that perhaps wasn't as important in time gone by, but has become much more important now in facilitating online meetings, facilitating discussion, being able to bring people together, confirm and demonstrate inclusive leadership so that people feel that they've been heard, they haven't left anything on the table. I think that's a skill that's become much more important now in this remote world that we're living in. And I think also the requirement for leaders to really recognise that almost every communication moment has to be intentionally created in this shift to remote and virtual working environments. There's very little that is really opportunistic. And we've spoken about that in the past around the lack of incidental conversation, water cooler talk, that kind of thing. And it's really true. And I think for people for whom it comes very easily and naturally to initiate contact, they've probably adjusted better to this new mode of working. And for others for whom it's not as natural, it's a bit of the sort of out of sight, out of mind, is a much more intentional behaviour that really needs to be created around initiating contact to create those moments of communication.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Marcel, and just causing me to reflect on it. When you were talking about, I mean, I was just thinking of mapping your comments onto my experience, and I think what is true is that the technology interface like we're having now is a much more scheduled thing. So so we might have a meeting now. If I'm in a meeting and I get a sense, and I'm trying to engage somebody, and their body language will tell me whether they don't want to or whatever. So there are limits to this. And so we all know that one you have, for inclusion, turn taking is very important, but also so people develop the skill of participating. The other thing is, of course, this psychological safety idea that people need to feel, and I think that's an issue that needs to be created both online and others. But whether it's more difficult for people to read body language when you've got all these small pictures, because psychological safety, part of it is anticipating other people's reactions, right? So
yes, exactly.
Now, there should be a norm of I don't have to worry about this, but it varies a bit. And then there's sort of the other key point, this sense of efficacy, this safety. And I think when you can read people's body language and you're close, some of these signals are easier to pick up. So that's one thing. But over time they would develop. I feel we've got this going, and I do think your point about a leader being able to facilitate his or her team is absolutely critical to the psychological safety and the efficacy, because nothing undermines efficacy than the sense of a meeting that goes nowhere. Where people dominate or whatever. But the other point I would make, and this. I was thinking about your comments, and so, there's the group meeting, but then there's the sort of one-on-one component. So if I'm talking to somebody about their confidence or the feelings of psychological safety, I would prefer to do that one-on-one. And so if we're in a meeting and I see somebody's not, is fully engaged or whatever, I'm more likely to be able to talk to them later. Now, on a Zoom meeting, I can either do it in the presence of other people, which is not as comfortable, or I can schedule a follow-up meeting, which is a whole lot more effort and less likely to happen because there's friction in the process. Scheduling is a highly frictional process. It takes time, often 2 or 3 emails and the like. Before we go off there, I just want to comment your point about bringing people in and facilitating this. I was mentioning how the team has these movies. And we're like, so we had a person, or we have a person, she's she's moving on because she's had a child. So, but she was the most introverted person, really difficult to get, to talk. So, blowing down, we discovered in this process, this really quite timid woman, her favourite movies are the Fast and Furious series, and she can talk about them in great detail, the different car chases. It was
That's
just like
fantastic.
So, there's a lot going on below the water, as you say, as people say. It was quite an amazing discovery. It was just such a fantastic contrast to who we thought she was and who she actually is. And I think she enjoyed us discovering that about her in a very safe way. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, we've really come full circle, haven't we? Back to that concept of bias, the biases that led to that initial conclusion, and then the surprise when she shared her interests.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, thank you so much. It's been fabulous conversing with you, and we look forward to staying connected. Thank you again.
Thank you, Marcel.
That's it for today's episode of Decoding Future Leadership. Thanks for listening. We'd really love to hear how your workplace is combining human capability and HR technology to redesign our hybrid working environments. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe to help us create a world of difference. Brought to you by People Strong and Fisher Leadership.